Do you think it's even safe for kids now to do what you did? Would it even be possible for them to do what you did back then?
No way. No way. They wouldn't be allowed. I mean, if my son, we don't even want to take him out on a day out to go on holiday. If we was going to go on holiday for 2 weeks, we wouldn't take him out on a Friday to have a day off school. So not in a million years. But I mean, I grew up in the 1970s. You know, it's like carp fishing very early 1980s. And it was a little bit different then. I think it was a lot more relaxed. You know, I weren't the only kid who was bunking school in those days. You know, there would have been quite a few of us. But there was a policeman who used to come round the lakes and chuck us off the lake, especially at Wanstead Park. I remember him clearly. He used to come round on an old push bike, really old-fashioned copper. And he used to come round and we'd all run and hide. And if he grabbed one of us, he'll be, "Why aren't you at school? Why aren't you at school?" And on more than one occasion, he literally used to walk you to the bus stop to get you out of the park. And every day he'd be round the park looking for kids, bunking school, fishing. But it was such a different world. In those days, the park lakes were full of anglers, full of kids. Everyone float fishing, you know. I don't know if the numbers of anglers have dropped, but it just seemed like everyone in them days wanted to go fishing. And it was a totally different world to what we've got now.
Most people who are outside of the big carp circle might have only come across you when you published your first book. What was the kind of thinking behind coming out of the shadows, if you like?
For a long, I mean, I originally, I never really come out of the shadows because in the 1980s, I was in quite a lot of, you know, I wasn't totally off the radar. In the 1980s, I was in the Angler's Mail a couple of times with some big fish. You know, I'd been in carp fishing books as well. So, you know, it hadn't totally been, you know, like no one had ever heard of me or ever seen of me. It hadn't been like that. But a lot of people over time were asking me, "Why don't you write a book?" I think one of the reasons that I wrote a book was because the stories that we had in them days were never to be repeated. You know, because carp fishing was so new and the way that the world was in those days, like me going off on a train for weeks when I should have been at school, it's never ever going to be repeated. And I always feel like that era was just such a one-off, and I think that's why the book was something that I wanted to do, because I had the stories and because I knew that with the stories that I've got, it'd make a good read, because it's such in a totally different world to what's going to be going on in the future and what is going on now.
I mean, I guess, yes, you had been in magazines, yes, you were known in big carp circles, but for the angling public, in a way you missed out on a huge boom through the late 90s, early 2000s, when the mags went huge, big names were made, lots of money was made.
Yeah.
During that time you were quiet.
Yeah, I was totally quiet. I got a little bit upset with carp fishing. You know, I suppose I was a bit of a sulker, really, in a sense, that because of the change. You know, I see the change come, and it was a little bit hurtful to see the way that carp fishing went, and it turned from something that we were all so passionate about to something that was become very commercial. Like, in a sense of some of the lakes that I fished in the early days, they totally changed. Once people realised that money, you know, could be earned, a lot of the lakes changed. For instance, the stocking programs and stuff like that. You know, some of the lakes that I fished, like Raisbury, for instance. You know, if we knew how hard it was to catch a fish out of Raisbury, and you know, to catch measles out of Raisbury, which wasn't a massive fish compared to some of the fish around, but was a massive achievement. But then you'd have a fish, picture of measles would be at the back of the magazine with a tiny little picture as big as this, and then at the front of the magazine would be an imported fish. that had been imported from a massive big gravel pit somewhere, and you know, had actually it had blown away everything that we had worked towards. Yeah, and I think Longfield as well was quite upsetting with what happened to Longfield, you know.
You'd better tell us, in order to go forward there, perhaps we ought to go back and just say, coming out of your childhood haunts, still a child effectively, you made the jump to the Colne Valley and to Longfield. Can you tell us a little bit about that period?
Yeah, I made quite a lot of jumps. In those days, 20 pounders were really hard to catch. A lot of my friends had never caught 20-pound fish, and I caught my first 20 when I was about 13. It was 26 pounder, which was a massive fish, you know, incredible fish. I know it doesn't sound like it now, but in those days it was. And then I went on to fish Hainault Forest in Essex, which held many of the, you know, real special carp. The big carp in Hainault Forest was an amazing looking fish, which would have been the brother of Basil, which originated from Sutton. So it was an amazing carp, and I caught that when I was 15. Should have been at school. I wasn't. At 36.5 pound, which is absolutely an amazing size fish. That was my first time that I ever got into the angling papers. I didn't want to publicise that fish, but what happened was the following night after I caught it, I had all my tackle stolen, and I won a couple of rods off the Angler's Mail, and I put it in. I was only 15, I was a kid, you know, and I won a couple of rods out of the Angler's Mail. So that was my first introduction to really big carp fishing. And at the time, a lot of the big names in carp fishing were fishing Hainault Forest. And I got quite a bit of a name from there because I caught all the fish in there, you know. I think there was only 8 or 9 mirrors in there at the time, big fish, and I caught all of those fish. So I started progressing from there. Then I went on to places like Darrantf Tip Lake. Well, Darrantf Tip Lake was it was the ultra carp fishing water at the time. If there was any magazines being published at the time, which there wasn't many, I think we had the Carp Fisher, which is Carp Society, which had just started. It was pretty much all about Darrantf Tip Lake because it was probably one of the best waters. I went on to there, I caught the Darrantf record when I was 17. I caught the biggest fish ever from Darrantf. I had all the, you know, so I was going around lakes and having some amazing fishing, and that's how I was sort of progressing. And I think by the time I was about 17, I'd caught 7 English 30s and loads of 20s.
Which must have made you one of the top big fish anglers in the country back then. 7 30-pounders.
Yeah, so definitely.
As a kid.
Yeah, I know. I was 17 years of age, and I'd had 7 30s. And
was there any resentment towards you because of your age?
Loads. You know, obviously the people who got to know me, they knew that, you know, I was obviously knew what I was doing. You know, I weren't just rocking up to a lake and fluking out fish. I was emptying lakes. I was catching a lot of fish, so I knew what I was doing. I was super keen,
and I think part of that success must have been down to your baiting approach, right?
Yeah.
Because you changed. That era was the Premier Baits fish meal era. Changed everything, didn't it?
Yeah. I mean, going back pre-Premier Baits, I think one of the big areas that changed my fishing was the way we were tying our rigs, because we were using spade end hooks. So if you think back at what the no knot is and what everyone's looking for was this kick, yeah, we were the first ones doing that, because what we were doing we were using spade end hooks in those days. We were using Orleans Dior's spade ends. And being lazy, we stopped tying our hair off the bend of the hook, and we'd get this whipping knot, and we used to just tie our hair straight off the whipping using Dacron. So we were the original ones. We were getting this kick, yeah? And everywhere we were going, we were just emptying places. And also what we found was one ingredient that really revolutionised what we were doing was Sluice CLO. And Sluice CLO was a bird food, and it was high in crumb. cod liver oil and some different bird food ingredients, and we started buying that down a local pet shop to us. And what we realised is we could get our milk proteins, cut it in half with Sluice CLO, and it made our bait so much cheaper. So all of a sudden we was able to put a lot more bait in. So then we were fishing over decent amounts of bait, and you know that made a massive difference. I think my first trip at Durham on a tip lake, I hooked 10. But this is pre-Premier baits, and we would sit there all day rolling bait on the bank. You know, every day one of our jobs would be in the morning to get up, have your bacon sandwich or whatever, and then roll bait. And that's what we've done. When we got onto the fish meals, which was a little bit later, more towards the late 80s, we realised that with Sluice CLO, fish meals, our baits become even more cheaper. So what we were making a 10-ounce mix for a couple of £3 or whatever it was when we first started, we could now make pretty much 3 kilos for that same money. So I think the amount of bait that we were putting in was having a big effect on the lakes that we were fishing.
This is really interesting to me because not only do I find that tip lake area quite fascinating, but two things stand out. One, that the incredible discipline that you had as a kid to sit there and be like, right, I have a job for today, and that's to roll bait all day long.
Yeah.
And then fire it into the lake.
Yeah.
And the second thing, that big baiting must have played a big part in your success.
Definitely. I mean, the reason that I caught all the hainhook fish was because I used to swim my bait out in the middle of the lake. And in them days, I couldn't afford boilies. This was pre-Sluice CLO. And I was using milk proteins. I used to buy them off of a company called SBS. It was a guy called Martin Cowles. And he had got a lot of information from a few guys who were fishing on Savay at the time. You know, so he had a real great access to some really good ingredients like Dutch caseins, calcium casinates. Now, I would always use these, but I could never afford to feed them. So I'd only use them 3 or 4 baits around a rod, a 10-ounce mix that'd have to last me a week. But that was in the days of peanuts. So Hainault Forest, for me, the main reason that I caught all the fish that I did out of Hainault Forest was because of nuts. And I used to cook a bucket of nuts up, a big bucket of nuts, and they'd last me for the whole week. So straight away, once I started doing that, I realised that getting the bait in the swim and more bait than anyone else, because in them days, people used to fish with 10 baits around their rods, you know. No one had access like they did now to 10 key. It was 10 baits. So I think when I started using a lot of peanuts, my catch rates went up a lot. And then when I could do that with boilies, my catch rates were high.
So the one thing we didn't touch on there is the discipline. So you are a teenager and you are working at your fishing like it's a job.
Yeah.
Tell us about the discipline that needed.
We were so keen, like it was unbelievable how keen we was in those days. I mean, when I fished Hainault, going back again there, you know, we used to wait till it was dark and we used to swim out with our baits at night, you know, and so just to do that in itself is crazy, isn't it? And then when I got to Durham, making baits on the bank and at Hainault, when we used to make baits on the bank, that was a part of our fishing. My mum banned me from the kitchen when I was really young. You know, the amount of times that my mum would come home from work and see my kitchen bombed with flavourings, and it was soon like, I'm not having it anymore, Tel, you know, I'm not having this anymore. And then we had to make the bait on the bank. And we used to arrive at the lake with no bait, just a sack of mix or a sack of ingredients, and we mix up the ingredients and our eggs, and that was it. And we used to make the bait before we actually fished. So we'd turn up, whoever we were, together, you know, and the first night, generally, we never fished. We had a lot more time in them days, so all our sessions were between 4 and 10 nights. So we'd turn up, make our bait, put it out warm. We always used to bait with warm baits. We always thought that was a big edge. You know, another ingredient I used to use a lot in those days was sesame seed oil. I used to use a lot of sesame seed oil in my baits, as well as attractors like flavourings and sweeteners, and always put them in warm. We always said if you put the bait in warm, it's got a good effect. And that's how it was. But yeah, the discipline, when you think about what we were actually doing, you know, I don't think we were blowing people away. People were turning up and then walking into our swim and never seeing anyone with a whole, you know, our sleeping bags we were using to dry our baits on. We were drying our baits on our sleeping bags, and now your sleeping bag would be lying on the floor and it'd just be a big carpet of boilies. I remember the first time I ever met Rob Malin, who was pretty much a legend in them days. You know, he'd fished about, he'd come walking into my swim, and he just was like, what is going on? You know, what are you actually doing? You know, because it's something that we done. I'm sure others done it as well. You know, I'm not saying that we were the first people ever to do it, but I'd never seen anyone do it, and that is what we've done.
Talk to us about the effect that it had. First of all, was there, from reading your book, I remember that there was hostility towards the fact that you were piling bait in. People didn't get it, like you've mentioned with Rob, but they were probably quite angry about the fact you were filling it in as well.
Yeah. I remember the start of the season at Darrenth, me and who I fished with at the time, we'd rolled, and the day before the Darrenth season started, we'd gone over a local park. This is where we used to, because our mum wouldn't let us no more. We'd gone over a local park, local to us, and we've rolled a massive big dustbin full of bait. And in them days, it was rolling 2 at a time or 3 at a time. We used to be able to do 3 at a time with your hand. And they're all big baits, you know, because if you're going to do a 50 egg mix, you ain't going to want to do tiny little baits. So it's all big baits. And we would literally, Darrenth, we turned up, absolutely filled it in, you know, and I don't think nothing was caught for the first 3 days of the season on the tip lake. And in them days, a lot of the big names were on the tip lake, and we were kids. These were guys who, you know, they had businesses, they had jobs, and you know, they'd been around for a long time, and they looked at us as inferior to them, you know. And
they thought you'd ruined the start.
Yeah, they thought we'd ruined their lake and we did. We ruined their fishing because they never caught nothing because we held the fish. And I remember when we fished Darrenth that year, that tip lake, which has become quite famous, our catches out of there, I think we held the fish for the first 6 weeks, you know, and I think the rest of the lake, you know, we were literally catching some fish twice a day. That's how ridiculous it got.
Do you think those fish were hooked on the high fat, high protein boilie?
Definitely. They were hooked on the high fat, they were hooked on the high protein, they were hooked on the amount of bait as well. You know, they were used to coming in a swim and seeing an handful of baits there. They might get 1 or 2. They've got a big carpet, a banquet. And what we were doing, we weren't silly. We'd fished hard lakes in the past and we'd emptied lakes before we went there. And so what we'd do, we had a little plan and we'd say, right, I'll tell you what we're gonna do now. We're gonna overbait for 2 days. So for 2 days, and we'll stop all the takes. We'll actually go mental, roll absolutely tons of bait, fill it in like you wouldn't believe, and then all of a sudden, then we'll say, right, 2 days, no bait, just the 20 round each rod. So we were even dictating what was coming next. And this is, you know.
Have you ever had fish literally dancing to your tune as much as they were ever again?
I have, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, a lot. Because I've learned how you can do this. You know. I mean, for instance, I'll pick one fish out. Big bollocks, very famous fish. You know, all the superstars wanted to catch big bollocks. That year, they told us that it was dead because the fish had been in the close season had been caught. Had been found dead. Sorry, in the close season, washed up, and everyone said, big bollocks is dead. Big bollocks is dead. Until I caught him twice in a day. I caught him in the morning and then I had him again in the afternoon. And then 3 days later, my mate caught him, Tony, who was with me. And it just become unbelievable. It was, and then we absolutely battered them out of one swim, one part of the lake. And we said, right, I'll tell you what we're gonna do now. We sat down, we had a little meeting. You know, it was amazing really, what we were doing. And we're gonna now move to a different part of the lake. because our results were so good, the rest of the anglers had gone. They'd had enough of watching these two kids. Yeah, they'd had enough. So we pretty much had the lake to ourselves. And then we moved into 2 other swims. When we moved into those 2 swims, we'd done exactly the same. We went round there, we put 60 egg mix, 70 egg mix, piled it in, give it a few days, went round there and we started having them again. And that's when I caught the big catch. I had 330s in a day.
Amazing.
Yeah, so.
And those fish benefited in terms of size, didn't they, as well?
Ah, yeah.
Because of that.
Not just size. We could see their scars were healing up. We could see their colours were better. They were fighting harder. You know, there were so many benefits to these fish. It really was unbelievable. And I mean, at the time, when I first went to Darren the year before, the lake record was about 31 pound. There was only 130 on the complex, 1 or 2 30s on the complex. By the time we'd left, the following year, it was about 10. And the lake record was 38 pound. So them fish had put on sort of 20%, 25% of their body weight, some of them. And they just looked better. You could just see that they just looked much better.
And how quickly did your style of baiting and fishing get out? And how quickly did you see other people doing it?
They were on it quick. One of the things that we didn't have in those days was funds. We didn't have a lot of funds. So we used to swap our ideas and tackle for food. So we would literally swap. You know, if someone turned up with a load of food, we'd say, right, do you want to be in our gang for a couple of days? You know, as long as we've got access to your bacon sandwiches. And I know it sounds silly now, but we were only kids and this was going on. So it wasn't long before a lot of other anglers started cottoning on, and they were just jumping in on our spots as well. So as soon as we left, they were watching where we were fishing, watching where we were baiting, pretty much copying us to a T.
How did it affect your mentality, Tal? Were you able to keep a sense of perspective, or did you think you were the man?
It weren't the first time that I'd emptied lakes. So I'd done it before. So I don't think I really got too big-headed about it. Carp fishing, maybe if it was now, it might have been different, but carp fishing was totally different in those days. So, you know, that sort of side of carp fishing, like now, people were catching fish to get as many likes as they can on Facebook and stuff like that. You know, we didn't have that. We didn't have any of that. So you'd only be in a little gang. At Darren, we were gods. We really was, and we knew that, you know. You know, for years after, if I ever walked around Darren, you know, people knew.
And they'd start talking.
People knew, you know, and they wouldn't want me on their lakes, and it affected me a lot. It probably didn't help me when I went to other lakes, because all of a sudden this kid has got this name, you know, or these kids have got this name out there.
And you fished a lot with your friend Tony. How important was your relationship and the ideas you came up with together?
Yeah, really important. We fished as a team. We fished as a team,
which is rare now.
Yeah, yeah. And I've never done it since. You know, I would never dream of fishing with someone else now. I've fished on my own since me and Tony stopped fishing together, which was 30 years ago now. You know, we fished as a team. What we'd do, one of us would be fishing and one of us would go on a recce. You know, we'd say, right, one of us, you go up that end, you know, and keep your eye on, and you know, and we fished as a team. And I was just as happy to see him catch a fish as I was to catch one myself. And he was the same with me, and I think that's what helped a lot in those days. And Tony went on to catch some amazing fish.
That we'll probably never see.
That were definitely never seen. The only time Tony's ever been in print would have been in my book, you know, and I've sat in Tony's house and he's got boxes and boxes and boxes of fish pictures.